The richest man in the building collapsed in a room full of executives, and the only person who stayed beside him was the girl nobody even remembered existed. The 43rd floor of Walker Dynamics still glowed at 2:13 in the morning, cold white office lights reflecting against the glass walls high above Manhattan, while rain slid slowly down the windows like the city itself was exhausted. Sophie Bennett tightened the sleeves of her oversized gray hoodie and pushed a cleaning cart down the silent executive hallway, her sneakers squeaking softly against the marble floor. Most people downstairs didn't even know her name. To them, she was just the office girl who stayed late, refilled printer paper, organized files nobody wanted, and cleaned conference rooms after executives finished pretending to save the world over $1,200 whiskey bottles. Her phone buzzed inside her pocket. Another hospital payment reminder for her mother's heart medication. Sophie stared at the notification for 3 seconds before locking the screen again. Not tonight. She couldn't think about numbers tonight. She still had 3 floors left to clean before catching the last subway to Queens. The giant conference room at the end of the hall was supposed to be empty, but as she pushed the door open, she froze. Ethan Walker sat alone at the far end of the 20-foot black glass table, still wearing a dark navy suit with the tie loosened around his neck. The CEO of Walker Dynamics looked nothing like the polished billionaire from magazine covers. His head rested against one hand, eyes closed, face pale beneath the dim, recessed lights. Half-finished reports covered the table beside him. The digital screen behind him still displayed quarterly losses in sharp red numbers. Sophie hesitated. "Sir." No answer. She stepped closer, heartbeat slowing uneasily. "Mr. Walker?" Then suddenly his body tilted sideways. The water glass slipped from his hand and shattered softly against the floor. Sophie rushed forward just before his shoulder hit the edge of the table. "Oh my God. Hey, can you hear me?" Ethan's breathing was shallow, uneven, like his body had finally lost a fight his mind had been forcing it to continue for weeks. Sophie looked toward the hallway. Empty. Of course it was empty. 15 minutes earlier, the board members had stormed out of the meeting screaming about investors, mergers, and public image while leaving their CEO behind like a burned-out machine. Sophie grabbed a bottled water from the table and wet a napkin carefully, kneeling beside him on the expensive carpet. "Rich people break too, huh?" she whispered softly. Ethan's eyes moved slightly at the sound of her voice, but never fully opened. Sophie sighed and looked at the rain outside. "You need sleep more than another meeting." She carefully folded her hoodie off her shoulders despite the freezing air conditioning and draped it over him. The soft vanilla scent from her cheap laundry detergent mixed strangely with the sharp smell of leather and expensive cologne surrounding him. For a second, Ethan's tense expression eased. Sophie noticed dark circles beneath his eyes now, the kind no amount of money could hide. He looked lonely, not powerful, not untouchable, just tired, deeply tired. She stayed there beside him longer than she meant to, quietly organizing scattered papers while the city lights flickered outside the glass walls. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across Manhattan. Then Ethan spoke without opening his eyes. "Why are you still here?" His voice sounded rough, almost confused. Sophie looked down at him, surprised he was awake at all. A sad little smile crossed her face. "Because somebody should be." The next morning, Ethan Walker replayed the security footage 3 times before sunrise. The executive security office was silent except for the quiet clicking of the monitor and the low hum of Manhattan traffic far below the tower windows. Frame by frame, he watched the grainy black and white footage from conference room 43, himself collapsing into the chair. The board members leaving without looking back. Then her. Small sneakers. Oversized gray hoodie. A cleaning cart pushed slowly through the doorway. Ethan leaned closer to the screen. He could not see her face clearly beneath the hood, but he remembered the voice. Calm, gentle, honest. Because somebody should be. Nobody had spoken to him like that in years. Not investors. Not assistants. Not even the people who claimed they cared about him. Everyone always needed something from Ethan Walker. Money, influence, approval. But that girl had looked at him like he was simply a tired human being. Nothing more, nothing less. Ethan loosened his tie slightly as another headache pulsed behind his eyes. He had slept barely 2 hours in his penthouse despite owning one of the most expensive apartments in Manhattan. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling skyline views. Silence worth $18 million. and somehow it still felt emptier than the conference room floor where he had almost passed out. His assistant Claire entered carefully with a tablet in hand. Your 8 o'clock investor briefing starts in 20 minutes. Ethan barely looked away from the monitor. Find her. Claire blinked. Sir. Ethan pointed toward the paused image on the screen. The girl in the hoodie. Claire stepped closer, confused. You want human resources? No, his answer came too fast. Too personal. Ethan cleared his throat and leaned back in the chair. I just need to know who was inside executive level after hours. Claire studied him for a second before nodding slowly. I will look into it. 20 minutes later, Ethan sat inside a glass conference room surrounded by executives discussing acquisition forecasts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But his attention kept drifting toward the elevator every time it opened. He hated that. He hated distractions, especially emotional ones. Yet sometime around noon, while another executive droned on about quarterly projections, Ethan noticed movement through the glass wall outside. A girl carrying 3 heavy archive boxes nearly stumbled as 2 men in suits brushed past her without helping. Gray hoodie tied around her waist. Ethan's heartbeat slowed strangely. Her. Sophie Bennett adjusted the boxes awkwardly and pushed open the archive room door with her shoulder before disappearing inside again like a ghost the building refused to notice. Ethan stared a second too long. Mr. Walker? Someone asked nervously from the table. Ethan looked away instantly. Continue. But his mind stayed on the girl downstairs with tired eyes and vanilla-scented laundry detergent. Later that evening, long after most employees had gone home, Ethan walked through the nearly empty office floors alone. The city outside glowed blue against the rain-soaked windows while janitors vacuumed distant hallways. Then he saw a small light upstairs near the rooftop access door. Sophie sat cross-legged beside the vending machines holding a cup of instant noodles, headphones resting around her neck while old jazz music played softly from her phone speaker. She looked peaceful for the first time all day. Ethan should have turned around. Instead, he walked toward her quietly. Sophie looked up suddenly, startled enough to nearly drop the noodles. Oh, Mr. Walker. Ethan noticed how quickly she stood up, nervous now, formal now, like the warmth from last night had never happened. He glanced at the cheap microwave noodles in her hands. Late dinner. Sophie gave a small, embarrassed smile. Night shift special. Ethan surprised himself by smiling back. Very slightly. Very real. Mind if I join you? Sophie stared at Ethan Walker like the entire skyline behind him had suddenly stepped into the room. For a second, she honestly thought he was joking. Billionaires did not sit beside girls eating 99-cent noodles near vending machines at midnight. They especially did not ask permission. You want to eat instant ramen with me? She asked carefully. Ethan glanced toward the empty chair beside her. I have been in meetings for 14 hours. At this point, I would eat cardboard. A laugh escaped Sophie before she could stop it. Quiet. Real. Ethan noticed immediately. It was the first genuine sound he had heard all day. Sophie hesitated before sliding the extra plastic fork across the small table toward him. Careful. This is luxury cuisine. Ethan sat down across from her, expensive suit and all, while rain tapped softly against the rooftop access door behind them. Up close, Sophie noticed he looked different tonight. Less polished. Less guarded. The sharp billionaire edges from magazine covers softened under the fluorescent light. He looked tired in a way sleep alone probably could not fix. Ethan took one bite of the noodles and raised an eyebrow. Too much sodium. Sophie gasped dramatically. Wow, you really are rich. Ethan surprised himself by laughing softly. It had been months since anything felt normal enough to laugh about. They sat in silence for a moment while old jazz music drifted quietly from Sophie's phone speaker. Somewhere downstairs, elevators dinged faintly through the giant building. Sophie tucked loose blonde hair behind her ear and stared out the nearby window at Manhattan glowing under the rain. Do you ever go home? Ethan asked finally. Sophie shrugged. Eventually. That bad? She smiled faintly without looking at him. Queen's Rent does not care if you are tired. Ethan studied her carefully now. The worn sneakers. The chipped nail polish. The careful way she stretched every bite of food like she was already planning tomorrow's expenses. He knew numbers better than people, but even he could recognize survival when he saw it. Sophie suddenly looked at him sideways. What about you? What about me? You own half this building and still sleep in conference rooms. Ethan looked down at the noodles quietly. Sometimes it feels easier to stay at work. Sophie nodded slowly like she understood more than he expected. Because when you stop moving, you start thinking. Ethan's eyes lifted toward hers instantly. No one ever understood that part. The silence between them shifted slightly then. Softer now. Dangerous in a way Ethan could not explain. Sophie stood and walked toward the old coffee machine near the wall. Want coffee? It is midnight. Exactly. She handed him a cheap paper cup 2 minutes later. Ethan took it carefully. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Warm. Human. Sophie sat back down, pulling her gray hoodie tighter around herself against the cold air drifting through the rooftop stairwell. Ethan noticed immediately. You should not have left your hoodie with me last night. Sophie shrugged. You looked like you needed it more. Ethan stared into the coffee cup silently. Nobody had ever given him something without expecting access, influence, or repayment attached to it. Yet this girl, barely making enough to survive, had offered kindness like it cost her nothing. Sophie suddenly groaned softly while checking her phone. Great. What? Double shift tomorrow. Ethan frowned. You already work nights. Hospital bills do not really care about sleep either. She said it casually, but Ethan noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath her smile. He noticed everything about her now. And for the first time in years, the billionaire who owned the building did not want the night to end. 3 weeks later, people inside Walker Dynamics started noticing something strange. The CEO had stopped leaving the office at 6 o'clock. Ethan Walker, the man famous for ending meetings exactly on time and ignoring every employee below executive level, suddenly lingered around the lower floors long after midnight. Sometimes he appeared near the copy room holding coffee. He clearly did not know how to make himself. Sometimes he sat quietly near the rooftop vending machines pretending to check emails while Sophie organized invoices beside him. Rumors started quietly, the way all dangerous things do inside corporate buildings. Sophie tried not to think about it. She already felt eyes following her through hallways whenever Ethan walked past and casually asked things like, "Did you eat dinner yet?" Or, "How is your mother doing?" Nobody in the building had ever heard the CEO ask an employee personal questions before, especially not an office girl from Queens wearing discount sneakers. But somehow the rooftop became theirs anyway. Every night after the building emptied, Sophie carried instant noodles upstairs while Ethan brought terrible coffee from the executive floor machine. They talked for hours beneath the soft glow of Manhattan lights reflecting through the rooftop windows. Not about billion-dollar deals. Not about investors. Just life. Real life. One rainy Thursday night, Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor beside the vending machine, sorting receipts, while Ethan loosened his tie nearby. You know what your problem is? She asked casually. Ethan looked up from his phone. I have several. You need to be specific. Sophie smiled softly. You never stop performing. Ethan frowned slightly. Performing? Being the perfect CEO. The perfect businessman. The perfect son. The perfect headline. Ethan leaned back against the wall quietly. Sophie continued organizing papers without realizing how deeply her words landed. People like you get so busy becoming impressive that nobody asks if you are happy anymore. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then he asked something no one in his world had asked him in years. Do you think I look unhappy? Sophie finally looked up. Her expression softened immediately. I think you look lonely. Silence settled between them. Heavy. Honest. Dangerous. Ethan looked away first. Outside the windows, rain blurred the Manhattan skyline into streaks of silver light. My father used to say loneliness is the price of leadership, Ethan said quietly. Sophie shook her head immediately. No, that is just what rich people tell themselves, so they do not have to trust anyone. Ethan laughed softly under his breath. You really are fearless around me. No, Sophie smiled faintly while pulling her gray hoodie tighter around herself. I just forget you are a billionaire sometimes. Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly at those words. Because around her, he forgot too. The next night, Ethan found a sticky note attached to the coffee machine upstairs. Terrible coffee. Try adding vanilla creamer this time. Sophie, he stared at the note for nearly 10 seconds before smiling to himself like an idiot. Claire nearly fainted the following morning when she saw the billionaire CEO smiling alone beside a vending machine. Days turned into nights. Nights turned into routines. Sophie started leaving tiny handwritten notes hidden around the executive floor. Do not skip lunch today. Drink water before your next meeting. Stop staring at spreadsheets at 3 in the morning like they insulted your family. Ethan kept every single one inside the top drawer of his office desk, beside her folded gray hoodie. Then one night, while sharing headphones beside the rooftop window as old jazz music played softly between them, Sophie fell asleep against his shoulder without realizing it. Ethan froze instantly. Her breathing slowed gently beside him while rain tapped softly against the glass above the city lights. He should have moved. He should have protected the boundaries between CEO and employee, billionaire and struggling office girl. Instead, Ethan carefully rested his head against hers and closed his eyes for the first peaceful moment he had felt in years. The secret should have stayed safe inside rooftop nights and handwritten notes, but secrets inside corporate buildings never stayed buried for long. It started on a Tuesday evening near the end of October. Sophie sat alone in the accounting archive room on the 36th floor, organizing old financial files while most employees attended a networking cocktail party downstairs. Rain hammered softly against the windows while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Sophie rubbed tired eyes and reached for another binder labeled Internal Acquisition Reports. She almost missed it at first. A folder wedged behind the cabinet with no department label attached. Strange. Sophie pulled it free carefully. Inside were transaction sheets and signed authorizations and payment records connected to offshore accounts she had never seen before. Millions of dollars transferred through shell companies over 3 years. Her forehead tightened slowly as she scanned the pages. None of it made sense. Walker Dynamics had entire legal departments to prevent hidden transactions like this. Then she saw a signature. Daniel Mercer, the company's chief financial officer. Sophie's stomach dropped slightly. Everyone inside Walker Dynamics feared Daniel Mercer almost as much as they respected Ethan Walker. Mercer controlled budgets, board relationships, investor communications, and most importantly, influence. Rumors said half the board answered to him behind closed doors. Sophie carefully slid the documents back into the folder, heartbeat suddenly louder now. Something about this felt wrong. Dangerous. The archive room door opened unexpectedly. Sophie nearly jumped. Ethan stepped inside, holding 2 paper coffee cups. Claire told me you disappeared up here. Sophie relaxed instantly. You scared me. Ethan smiled faintly while handing her coffee. That was not my intention. Then he noticed her expression. What happened? Sophie hesitated before slowly showing him the folder. Ethan's face changed almost immediately as he scanned the documents. Calm disappeared from his eyes first. Then something colder settled in its place. Sophie had never seen that side of him before. Not the tired, lonely billionaire from rooftop nights. This was the CEO who built a billion-dollar empire before turning 35. Focused, sharp, dangerous in silence alone. Where did you find this? Ethan asked quietly. Behind the accounting cabinet. Ethan flipped through several pages quickly. His jaw tightened harder with every document. These transactions were never approved through executive review. Sophie looked at him carefully. Is it bad? Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. If these numbers are real, someone inside this company has been moving money through fake consulting firms for years. Sophie's chest tightened. Daniel Mercer signed everything. Ethan became very still. Too still. Mercer has controlled corporate finance since my father owned this company. Then why would he? Sophie stopped herself. Ethan closed the folder carefully. Because people get comfortable when they believe nobody is watching. Silence settled heavily between them. Rain continued hitting the windows while distant music from the cocktail party echoed faintly through the hallway below. Sophie suddenly realized how close they stood now. Ethan looked exhausted again, but differently this time. Not emotionally exhausted. Strategically exhausted. Like a man who suddenly understood betrayal might already be sitting inside his own boardroom. You should not be involved in this, Ethan said quietly. Sophie frowned immediately. I already am. Ethan looked down at her for several long seconds. Mercer is powerful, Sophie. So are you. Ethan gave a humorless smile. Not in the same way. Sophie reached toward the folder carefully. What are you going to do? Ethan looked toward the rain-covered skyline outside the archive room windows. Find out how deep this goes before the board meeting next month. Then his eyes returned to her. Softer now. Protective now. And until then, nobody can know you found these documents. Sophie nodded slowly. Ethan carefully took the folder from her hands, but before stepping away, his fingers brushed gently against hers for just a second too long. You trust me? He asked quietly. Sophie looked directly into his eyes. More than I probably should. Neither of them noticed the security camera above the archive room door, silently recording everything. The annual Walker Dynamics Winter Gala looked like something pulled from a Billionaire fantasy magazine. Crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of guests dressed in black tuxedos and shimmering gowns, while a live jazz band played near the marble staircase overlooking Manhattan. Cameras flashed constantly. Investors laughed too loudly. Executives shook hands like politicians preparing for war. Sophie had never belonged in places like this. She stood near the ballroom entrance, clutching a silver tray of champagne glasses while trying not to stare at the ocean of diamonds, luxury watches, and designer dresses moving around her. Her borrowed black uniform suddenly felt painfully small inside a room worth more money than she could imagine. "Do not spill anything," another assistant whispered beside her before hurrying away. Sophie nodded quietly. She had almost skipped the gala completely, but Ethan insisted she attend after learning several employees had called in sick. "Just stay near the back," he told her earlier that afternoon with concern hidden carefully behind his usual calm expression. "And if anything feels strange, leave immediately." Sophie still remembered the way his eyes lingered on her before walking into another board meeting. Something had changed in him over the past 2 weeks. He looked sharper now, colder toward executives, more distant during meetings. Daniel Mercer noticed too. Sophie could feel it every time the CFO looked at her across the office floor, like he already suspected something. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the evening presentation began. Ethan stepped onto the stage beneath massive digital screens displaying Walker Dynamics logos across the walls. The crowd applauded instantly. Sophie hated how handsome he looked tonight. Dark tailored suit, calm billionaire smile, perfect posture. From far away, nobody would ever guess this was the same man who shared vending machine noodles with her after midnight. Ethan's gaze moved across the crowd while delivering his speech about innovation, leadership, and the future of the company. Then for half a second, his eyes found Sophie near the back wall. The smallest shift crossed his face. Softer. Human. It lasted barely a moment before the ballroom screens suddenly flickered. The music stopped. Confused murmurs spread across the room. Ethan turned sharply toward the giant presentation screen behind him. Sophie's stomach dropped instantly. Security footage filled the ballroom wall in perfect high definition. Her and Ethan on the rooftop, sharing headphones, laughing beside vending machines. Him resting his head gently against hers while rain covered the windows behind them. Another clip followed immediately. Ethan holding her gray hoodie inside his office. Sophie slipping handwritten notes beside his coffee cup. The ballroom exploded with whispers. "Who is she?" "That is the office assistant." "Oh my God, the CEO?" Sophie's face burned with humiliation so fast she could barely breathe. Every executive eye in the room turned toward her at once. Some shocked, some disgusted, some amused. Daniel Mercer slowly stood near the front table, holding a champagne glass casually. "Well," he said smoothly into the heavy silence, "it appears our CEO has been conducting private after-hours activities with junior staff." Laughter spread through part of the room. Sophie froze completely. Ethan stepped away from the podium immediately. "Turn that screen off." His voice cut sharply across the ballroom. Mercer ignored him. Another rooftop clip played behind them. Sophie looked suddenly tiny against the giant screen. Vulnerable. Poor. Completely exposed in front of Manhattan's wealthiest people. A woman near the investor tables whispered loudly enough for Sophie to hear. "A cleaning girl seduced the CEO." How predictable. Ethan's entire expression changed. Cold disappeared instantly. Fury replaced it. Real fury. Enough. The single word silenced the ballroom. Ethan walked directly towards Sophie through rows of frozen executives while cameras flashed wildly around them. Sophie could barely look at him now. Her hands trembled beside the champagne tray. Ethan reached her and carefully took the tray from her shaking hands before setting it aside. Then he stood beside her openly in front of everyone. Not hiding anymore. Not pretending anymore. Daniel Mercer smiled faintly across the ballroom. "Careful, Ethan. Investors are watching." Ethan never looked away from Sophie when he answered. "Then maybe they should learn what loyalty actually looks like." By midnight, every gossip website in Manhattan had already posted the photos. Billionaire CEO secret affair with poor office girl. The headlines spread faster than rainwater down city sidewalks. Blurry screenshots from the ballroom flooded social media while business analysts debated Ethan Walker's professional judgment on live television like his heart had become a corporate scandal for public entertainment. Sophie sat alone on the edge of her bed in her tiny Queens apartment staring at her cracked phone screen while notifications kept exploding across social media. Some comments mocked her clothes. Others accused her of manipulating Ethan for money. One headline called her the cleaning girl who climbed too high. Sophie locked the phone quickly before tears could fully fall. Across the room, her mother slept quietly beneath dim lamplight, unaware of the storm destroying her daughter's life outside those apartment walls. Sophie pulled Ethan's gray coffee mug closer between both hands, even though the tea inside had already gone cold. She could still hear the ballroom whispers replaying in her head. Cleaning girl, gold digger, opportunist. She thought she could survive embarrassment. She thought rooftop nights with Ethan had made her stronger than public opinion. But she forgot wealthy people did not just destroy reputations quietly. They made spectacles out of them. Her phone buzzed again. Ethan. Sophie stared at his name across the screen for nearly 10 seconds before declining the call. Another came immediately after. Then another. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. Sophie closed her eyes before pressing play. Sophie, please answer me. Ethan's voice sounded exhausted. Raw. I do not care about the headlines. I do not care about the board. Just tell me where you are. Silence followed for a second before his voice lowered softly. You do not have to disappear every time the world gets cruel. Sophie covered her mouth tightly as tears finally escaped. Because part of her wanted to run straight back to the rooftop and let Ethan hold her until the noise disappeared. But another part understood something terrifying now. Daniel Mercer was not just humiliating her. He was using her to weaken Ethan publicly before the board meeting. And if she stayed close to Ethan, Mercer would keep coming. Harder, smarter, colder. Sophie stood slowly and walked toward the small kitchen counter where unpaid medical bills sat stacked beside her mother's prescriptions. She looked around the apartment quietly. Peeling paint, flickering hallway light outside the door, tiny heater barely working against November cold. This was her reality. Ethan belonged to skyscrapers, investors, headlines, and billion-dollar wars. Sophie belonged to survival. At 2:30 in the morning, she returned to Walker Dynamics one final time. The giant lobby stood almost empty except for overnight security guards watching television near the front desk. Sophie avoided eye contact while carrying a small cardboard box upstairs to the executive floor. Ethan's office lights were still on beneath the glass walls. Of course they were. He never slept anymore. Sophie's chest tightened painfully at the sight of him through the window. Ethan sat alone at his desk with loosened tie, exhausted eyes, and papers scattered everywhere, while television screens behind him replayed gala footage on silent news broadcasts. He looked completely alone inside a room built for power. Sophie waited until he left for another emergency board call before slipping quietly into the office. Her hands trembled as she placed the folded sticky notes carefully beside his desk lamp. Drink water before your next meeting. Stop staring at spreadsheets like they insulted your family. The small pieces of happiness they built suddenly felt fragile enough to break in her hands. Finally, Sophie removed her gray hoodie from the back of Ethan's office chair, where he secretly kept it every day. She held it against herself for a moment before folding it carefully on the desk beside one last handwritten note. You deserved peace before you deserved me. I am sorry I made your life harder. She stared at the note for several seconds, fighting tears one last time. Then Sophie Bennett walked out of Walker Dynamics before sunrise carrying nothing except a backpack, a broken heart, and the terrifying hope that leaving Ethan behind might save him. For 6 days, Ethan Walker barely left his office. The rooftop stayed empty. No instant noodles. No jazz music drifting softly through the midnight air. No handwritten sticky notes hidden beside the terrible coffee machine. Just silence. The kind that settled deep inside a person and stayed there. Claire watched her boss unravel slowly behind glass office walls while Manhattan moved around him like nothing had changed. Ethan stopped shaving regularly. He ignored investor dinners. He canceled 3 television interviews and frightened half the executive team by tearing apart financial reports until sunrise every night. But Sophie's disappearance did something even worse than heartbreak. It removed the last distraction protecting him from the truth. Daniel Mercer thought humiliating Sophie would weaken Ethan emotionally. Instead, It turned him into something colder, sharper, impossible to manipulate. Ethan stood alone in the executive archive room at 3 in the morning, rereading every hidden transaction Sophie discovered weeks earlier. Offshore transfers, fake vendor contracts, unauthorized consulting payments worth nearly $80 million over 4 years. Mercer had not just stolen money. He had built an entire shadow system inside Walker Dynamics, while everyone focused on quarterly profits and public image. Ethan's jaw tightened as another document confirmed the truth. Mercer even used company funds to pressure board members privately through hidden investments connected to their families. Control disguised as loyalty. Ethan finally understood why his father trusted Mercer for decades. The man knew exactly how to make powerful people dependent on him. Claire entered carefully, carrying fresh coffee. The board meeting starts in 2 hours. Ethan did not look up from the files. Good. Claire hesitated. There is still time to postpone this. Ethan finally lifted his eyes toward her. Exhausted. Hollow. Dangerous. Mercer publicly destroyed an innocent woman to protect himself. His voice stayed calm, but Claire heard the anger beneath every word. I am done postponing things. At 9 o'clock sharp, the Walker Dynamics boardroom filled with executives, investors, lawyers, and media representatives. Rain crashed against the giant windows overlooking Manhattan, while tension spread across the polished glass table. Daniel Mercer sat near the center, looking perfectly composed in a charcoal suit worth more than most employees made in 2 months. Before we begin, Mercer said smoothly, I believe the board deserves clarification regarding recent inappropriate relationships affecting company stability. Ethan entered the room before anyone could answer. Silence followed instantly. Every eye turned toward him. Ethan looked different today. Not polished. Not corporate. Focused. The kind of focus people carried right before tearing something apart completely. He placed a thick stack of documents on the conference table. You are right, Daniel, Ethan said calmly. The company deserves clarification. Mercer's expression barely shifted. Then perhaps you would like to explain the scandal your behavior created. Ethan pressed a remote control. The giant screen behind him lit up immediately. Financial transfers, shell corporations, secret account numbers, signed authorizations. Mercer's face finally lost color. I would rather explain why our chief financial officer stole nearly $80 million from this company while manipulating the board through illegal offshore accounts. The room exploded instantly. Executives shouted. Lawyers stood abruptly. Board members grabbed documents with shaking hands. Mercer rose from his chair furiously. You cannot prove those records are authentic. Ethan stepped closer slowly. Calmly. Actually, Sophie Bennett found the first files by accident. Mercer froze completely. Ethan continued without mercy now. The same woman you humiliated publicly because you were terrified she would expose you. The room fell silent again. Ethan looked around the boardroom carefully. You mocked her because she worked late nights. Because she came from Queens. Because she did not wear designer dresses or speak like investors. His voice lowered harder now. But the poorest woman in this company was the only honest person in this entire building. No one spoke. Not even Mercer. Ethan loosened his tie slowly while rain hammered against the windows behind him. You all spent weeks asking whether Sophie Bennett was good enough for Walker Dynamics. His eyes turned cold as steel. The real question is whether Walker Dynamics was ever good enough for her. 6 months later, the rooftop lights at Walker Dynamics finally turned back on. Winter had melted into a warm Manhattan spring, and for the first time in years, employees no longer lowered their voices in fear whenever executives walked past. Daniel Mercer was gone. Half the corrupt board members resigned within weeks after the investigation became public. Financial magazines called Ethan Walker ruthless for exposing his own company so publicly. Employees called him something else entirely. Honest. But none of it mattered much to Ethan anymore. Not the headlines. Not the interviews. Not the billion-dollar recovery projections investors praised him for rebuilding. Because every night when the office emptied and city lights flickered beyond the glass windows, the rooftop still felt unbearably quiet without Sophie Bennett sitting beside him complaining about his terrible coffee. Ethan searched for her for months. Quietly at first, then desperately. Queens libraries, community centers, hospital volunteer programs. He even rode the subway himself for the first time in nearly 3 years because Claire once overheard Sophie talking about her favorite station musician near Brooklyn. Nothing. It was like Sophie disappeared into New York completely. Then one rainy Thursday evening, Ethan received a handwritten envelope delivered directly to his office desk. No return address. Inside was a single flyer for a small community library opening in Brooklyn. Free tutoring, free books, free coffee every Friday night. At the bottom corner, written in familiar handwriting, were 4 words. Your coffee still sucks. Ethan laughed out loud for the first time in months. 20 minutes later, he was already in the back seat of a car speeding through rain-covered streets toward Brooklyn. The community library looked small compared to the towers Ethan usually lived inside. Warm yellow light glowed softly through old windows while children's drawings covered the front glass doors. Ethan stopped just outside the entrance for a second, suddenly nervous in a way billion-dollar negotiations never made him feel. Then he saw her. Sophie stood on a small ladder inside the library, hanging paper stars across the ceiling, while soft jazz music played from an old speaker near the bookshelves. Her blonde hair was tied loosely now. Simpler clothes. Softer smile. Peaceful. She looked happy. Ethan forgot how to breathe for a moment. Sophie turned slightly while stepping down from the ladder and froze instantly when she saw him standing in the doorway wearing a dark coat soaked from rain. Neither of them moved. The entire world suddenly felt quiet again. You found me, she whispered softly. Ethan stepped inside slowly. You left clues. Sophie laughed quietly through surprised tears. I was not sure if you would understand them. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled something out. Her gray hoodie, folded neatly despite months passing. Sophie stared at it in shock. You kept it. Ethan looked down at the hoodie for a second before answering honestly. I think I kept every part of you I could. Sophie's eyes filled immediately. Rain tapped gently against the library windows while warm light surrounded them both. Ethan stepped closer now, close enough to see the emotion trembling behind her smile. The company is changing, he said quietly. The rooftop still has terrible coffee. Claire still threatens to quit every Tuesday. Sophie laughed softly through tears again. Ethan's voice lowered carefully. But none of it feels right without you there. Silence stretched between them. Beautiful, fragile, real. Then Ethan slowly lowered himself onto one knee right there between children's bookshelves and paper stars hanging from the ceiling. Sophie covered her mouth instantly in shock. Ethan looked up at her with tired eyes that no longer belonged to a lonely billionaire hiding behind skyscrapers. They belonged to a man finally honest enough to love without fear. You once told me rich people keep performing because they are afraid to trust anyone, he said quietly. You were right. He held out a small velvet ring box carefully. But you made me feel safe enough to stop performing. Tears rolled down Sophie's cheeks as Ethan smiled softly up at her beneath the warm library lights. So let me love you without hiding this time. Sophie nodded before she could even speak. Ethan stood immediately as she threw her arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time, while rain shimmered softly against the Brooklyn windows behind them. Months later, long after the headlines disappeared and Manhattan moved on to newer scandals, the rooftop at Walker Dynamics filled once more with quiet jazz music, instant noodles, and city lights glowing across the skyline. Only this time, neither of them sat there alone anymore.